Welcome to Duncan Thorin Shield's YouTube channel. I managed to con Duncan into convincing his friend to pay me thousands of dollars as a professional Counter-Strike player, so maybe he can convince you that some of his analysis is correct.
Right, this is another episode, the second episode of Know-It-Alls of Counter-Strike. Still haven't decided to invite a guest. I mean, listen, use your fucking brain. If we know it all, what would we need someone else here to talk about? They're just interrupting us, if anything. By the way, you know that basically the theme of this show is sort of the joke that I got you to do for that ident, where it's like, you know, I was on the desk for this many years, I was in a team. I don't know anything about Counter-Strike and neither stuff like that. Like that one that is pure banter, because it is the sort of stupid shit that people used to say. Because if people don't know, even though lurppis' pro career only ended the year that CSGO came out, people, no joke, like 6 months into the game, were talking as though you were just a journalist and like you actually had never played the game and like that you just didn't understand basic fun. Like, it was so crazy how off they were, wasn't it?
Maybe I never did. I just got lucky.
I also love, by the way, that luckily it has died down now, probably because we did so many events on the desk or whatever, and you know, the original fans probably got diluted. But you know, for like the first year or so, we also used to just get wrecked because we didn't just sing the praises of CSGO as a game when it was shit, and we used to point out the problems. And you know the most brutal thing, because I saw the other day on Reddit, someone posted like an old interview with Neo in a Polish magazine when the game first came out, and dude, he just flames the fuck out of it. Like, he basically says like, Valve has yet again failed to make a sequel to Counter-Strike. Like, but that's the worst thing, because all those guys, the second they started playing as pros, just shut the fuck up and pretended they never said any of that stuff at the end of 1.6. It's just us who carry the can as being haters. Dude, everyone at the end of 1.6 hated the game. Everyone.
I've had some funny conversations with like the players who are the very best in CSGO when it came out for the first, you know, like winning like the tournaments in the first year, and they would just tell me at events, it'd be like, listen, dude, like, have you ever played Source? And I'm like, not really. And they're like, you should try it because Source is amazing. It turns out you just have to be used to CSGO first.
Oh, do you want to know the sad thing? Listen, I thought Source was shit because I had the choice of 1.6, but I'm not lying. I went and tried Source, and for a start off, the spray is really good. Like, I mean, it might be a bit too easy, but like, if you compare to what a nightmare to almost to this day, the CSGO sprays, it feels amazing. Like, that's just how fucked CSGO is. Like, every time I think, that's a pretty good game, it's like, maybe I won't try 1.6 so again. It might just make me sad, like I mentioned on the last episode.
Yeah.
By the way,
what you really need is just get like original Counter-Strike just remastered in better graphics. That would be
here's the problem with
the
that,
ideal outcome.
Because someone did bring this up on one of my like Patreon discussions. I told them the story of Alex Garfield in the fucking CS Pro mod, and that it basically was that. 'Cause it was even in the Source, like Gold Source engine or whatever that they sort of used to also make CSGO. And I basically just said it. The worst thing about it was, before CSGO came out, it even proved it was possible. And then CSGO just never did any of that stuff. And so then, unfortunately, like all naive fans, they were just like, so why didn't anyone use it? I was like, oh, that's also good that they didn't, because Alex Garfield owned it. And like, I'm not sure which is worse, because that's like going into some sort of Mark Zuckerberg like nightmare territory if he owns everything. So sadly, I don't think that's ever going to happen. We're never going to get that fucking mod, are we? Everyone loves CSGO, mate. They all think it's the pinnacle.
No, but that did prove though that it is possible. It like by the end, Pro Mod really felt like 1.6. It just took like 4 years too long because they never, you know, like today you would have just raised money and you would have done it.
Exactly. Oh, that's the saddest part.
And like then it was just a hobby project. So like, you know, it took like 3-4 years because it was just people doing it part time, you know, on top of their jobs.
Well, the saddest thing is it really could have worked. It's just that like, you'd have to have shifted everything forwards 10 years. Like if Source had been out because no one liked it and everyone was sticking with 1.6 and then the only way to move the scene on was having it would have just happened. That would have been the logical way. Yeah, I agree. By the way, did you see... I know you did because I linked you just to trigger you. But since we're the know-it-alls, we'll just comment on this a little bit. So you know when all those betting companies, aside from when they just steal everyone else's content off broadcasts and stuff and put it on their Twitter because, you know, apparently there are no fucking like DMCA rules on Twitter yet. But aside from when they're doing that, when they actually pull their finger out the arse and do a bit of work, they do some pretty decent features where, you know, they just ask like the bozo players, like, what's your favourite gun, a.k.a. I like the M4. Like, you know, when they just ask them all that shit. So I linked you to the one where they were like, which were better, CSGO Pros or 1.6? First of all, almost every player interviewed, obviously, CSGO Pros. So, unsurprisingly, lurppis, all the CSGO Pros are like, I think that 1.6 was not that much skill and CSGO is like new. It's like, I mean, you know it's coming anyway, but I will give props to a couple of them. A couple of them towards the end were actually a bit based and sort of like, were like, no, I think 1.6 was better, you know, like the height that they were at. Like, what did you think of that video? Because like I say, I was trying to trigger you with that mix. I just knew, because it's the reasoning they gave was so specious. It was so stupid, some of the stuff they were saying. But, what did you think of it? Come on.
Well, I mean, I think some of the opinions are a little bit colored, but I will start off by saying that I obviously think that the skill ceiling is higher today. That's how everything works. Like if you look at hockey in the 80s, like obviously the people today are better because they built on top of like what they saw in videos and got learned from other
and all
people.
The equipment and everything. Everything.
Yeah. So like obviously like people are more mechanically skilled.
Yes.
Like everybody's aim is better, etc. Today. There's no question about it. With that said, like some of the comments in that video are just like it's like people have never seen a game.
Yes.
Like people made it out to seem like it was literally just like 5 bozos off of ESCA just playing together. People didn't come. People didn't have roles. No one had anything planned. People didn't know how to throw smokes, and people were just like running left and right, like playing with their keyboards, like with their friend playing the space bar to open doors and like shoot with enter. It's just like just a game like that. It's just a little.
Listen,
unreal.
Obviously this is mildly awkward because he does play for your org, but the one that I really did appreciate, remember I messaged this, was Cold Zero, where his comment, I think it was Cold Zero, that just said that like CS 1.6 was almost entirely aim, and it's like, I would have described it the opposite, my dude. I always used to say to people, it's amazing how many champions didn't even have close to the sickest aim. They just like knew the game and played well. Like, what a weird angle, because if anything, I would go the opposite way. I would say, like, look at CSGO, mate. CSGO's the game where the aimers thrive and all the fucking like supportive elements are like, fuck, I can't keep up, and they just get cut from the teams over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely that way. The part of it is also, by the way, that like we said, the skill ceiling's higher today. So as a result, like by definition, there was less skill previously, which meant that like more of the game was decided on the other stuff.
True.
We discussed this briefly at the time, but like Neo was like a superstar in that game. He's a very skilled player, obviously, great individually. One of the has a case for being the GOAT in 1.6, but like he doesn't have the kind of aim that players today do. And like everybody else on his team, like Taz was the second best player in all those legendary teams that Neo played on, and he was like
he'd be the worst aimer on a team now.
Yeah, like he was like a pretty good like pro player, but he wasn't like a skilled player by any means, and like those teams by no means relied on skill at any point. So I think like that's just like a good case study for like how little skill mattered back then, because he was all about the other stuff.
And the reason, by the way, fans were bringing up that particular team is they did win all the motherfucking majors, including over all those Swedes that you all just bow and worship and like those motherfuckers used to go in the server. Listen, if it was about aim, Forrest would have like 15 majors or something when he has 3. He had 3 in that game. And by the way, I once did an article where I pointed this out. He had more chances than anyone. He was in 1 billion finals. He was the favourite in almost every one. So if it's all about aim, why didn't he just shoot him in the head? Because it isn't about aim, is it? Like, and by the way, I totally agree with you. I always used to say,
better teammates, by the way, as well.
Exactly.
It's not just him.
And he had the rotating cast dude where he was just bringing in the next talents. Whereas like Neo was like, better just convince Lord to just fucking be good again. Like that's the only way he can win a major, isn't it? No, the most brutal thing about it is, I always used to think that about Neo. The reason why I did think he was the chosen one in CS is because you would watch his POV, and listen, he definitely had a lot of highlights, but it's like when I had my boy Athid make that movie. That movie is dog shit compared to the Forest one. Neo's is just like, oh, you got a nice 3K, shooting them all in the chest. It's like, the Forest one's like, it just does like stuff that looks like cheating, doesn't it? Like the Neo ones, like you're saying, put it this way, this will sound like sacrilege because I do think that Neo's the GOAT. Because I'm chauvinist to 1.6, let's face it. But I would say this, right? If I tried to think of a player who's like Neo in terms of like aim and like pretty good and I think he's more like Crims, mate, where the aim's just like nothing special, but they just get lots of kills, they play their position well, they're reliable, don't tilt. Like, well, the point I'm making here is I still consider Crims a great player, but no one's like wanking off over him, are they? No one's going, oh my God, like, I can't wait to see a Crims frag movie. Like, it's just a really good player, isn't he?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good comparison. I think the only thing is like Neo's more versatile, but half of it was just like he was just forced to be more versatile because otherwise he couldn't win. Like there were all those classic games where they would be playing normal until it was 14-14 in the major semis, and then Neo would basically look at Luke and be like, "Listen, dude, I'm taking that op now, so you get the dig."
Yes. Put it this way, the analogy would be, it's like one of the reasons why Michael Jordan's probably is the GOAT of basketball is because he also had to put in so much effort on defense because he just didn't have that many good defenders on his team aside from Scottie Pippen. So as a result, right, think about it. If you were like Magic Johnson or something, you just had someone like Michael Cooper. You were like, yeah, you just go and defend that guy. I don't want to waste my energy. So it's like, as weird as it sounds, it's like that famous quote we have in English. You know, that adage that like necessity is the mother of invention. It's like when you're forced to change, if you're a truly great player, you just will, won't you? But if you don't need to, if you could just do what you're doing and that worked every time, you had awesome teammates, yeah, why the fuck would you? It's one of the reasons I've always thought why Forrest could just chill. Because he's had such awesome teammates. It's like someone else might just be good in this game. If they all just chilled for 3 months and played fucking Diablo or something, they'd be going out last place, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, Forrest also got a bunch of wins in 09 and 010 and even 11 just because of Get Right, where like Neo never had anybody who was like, I think there was like one ESWC where you could make the case that Task maybe played the best out of anybody there, and that was like towards the end of their careers, and like that's just like you making the case, like it's not necessarily true.
Yes. Right, okay, so one thing I thought, it leads on actually from the discussion we're having now, is we could have a discussion that people are going to think is boring, because it's been had many times on other shows. But the point is, usually I was the only one who sort of had more arguments and more depth to it, and the other people, they hadn't really just thought about it much. So but the topic basically is the idea of like roles in the game, or another concept I've actually tried to invent and make terminology the last few years is not just roles, but like role balance. So for example, if you have like a really good like hard entry aggressive player, then you probably want some sort of like Cold Zero type motherfucker to come and clean up at the end of the round. Like you know from your teams, mate. I mean, the reason I bring this up is you were one of the first IGLs I'm aware who actually even understood this concept, because again, funnily enough, the necessity is the mother of invention, right? You didn't want to, lurppis. You wanted just to have a bunch of good players who would listen to you and do what was necessary. But instead, what you ended up with was the two best players in your team who could not be cut, not least because they refused to cut themselves. One of them was like, I go forwards all the time. And then the other one was like, I play with shift, which is my walk key, permanently on. So you had the two most extreme ends of and by the way, there wasn't even like, we didn't even really use the term lurker back then or entry. Like, these motherfuckers just only wanted to play these two ridiculous styles. So as a result, if you have those players, you're going to start to basically build out a team that makes sense, right? You're going to have somone who works in between, and the AWP's going to play like it. You get this concept, right? So where do you come down on this? The idea of roles or whatever. Like, obviously, I'm not saying, as people try to make it, like you have to have set roles, like people think in basketball you have to have those 5 roles. Like almost no team does, by the way. I don't know why people keep saying that. Like, in the modern day, there's almost no centers. Like, there's about 1 billion fucking stretch 4s, and everyone shoots 3-pointers. So it's like that. I don't know why everyone's pretending like basketball's a hard and fast rule. No, it's just a way of like modeling the game. So where do you come down on the idea of roles in Counter-Strike, at least CSGO?
I mean, to some extent, I think you end up having roles, even if it's not intentional, if you play together for long enough. Now, like, they may vary more and more, but I think sort of naturally, if you keep playing, and I think everybody would notice this, even just playing with their friends over and over and over again, like, you kind of end up doing the same things, because it's just an easier way of practicing, easier way of getting more reps and, improving quicker. So I think you naturally end up there regardless. I think that's the number one reason that I remain very skeptical of 6-man rosters in Counter-Strike. I just think the continuation that you get from having the same people doing the same things over and over and over again is what effectively allows you to become better than the sum of allows the team to become better than the sum of its parts over time. And I think if you keep constantly meddling and changing things, I don't think you can get there. I do agree that at least like in the earlier years of Counter-Strike, when I was playing, so like call it like 2005 to 2008 or something, I don't think people generally speaking thought of there being many different roles. So, you'd have someone who usually ops, though that wasn't even necessarily the case in my team. It's just sort of whoever,
yes.
Just because of the personnel that we had. You normally had somebody who tended to be the first person in, but that wasn't necessarily like a talking thing. I think the whole talking point about being the entry fragger only started later on. I think initially it was just sort of somebody who happened to be that person who liked playing that role. And then I also think a part of this is, by the way, is driven by stats becoming so much more pronounced. Sure. I think that started in like 2009, maybe. Godfrag started earlier, but I don't think they were a big thing because they didn't have proper coverage. And then Agile TV launched theirs in like 2009, 2010, and I think that's when people started paying more attention. So I think a part of it was also that, once people needed sort of excuses for, hey, why are you always on the red? that's where people started coming up with all these things and like talking about them more. Not that they weren't true before that, but like
Sure.
that's sort of the necessity there that I think led people to talk about it. More generally or more broadly, I guess, in just thinking of roles, I think that I think it's really hard to replace players without thinking about roles. I think there's a bunch of teams historically, including some of mine, where roster changes have just like kind of happened without a lot of thought. And sometimes it's just a question of the talent pool of who's available. And sometimes it just forces some people to completely change how they're playing, and that doesn't always go well. We've seen a lot of examples of that, and I think if anything, like that's probably the best proof that roles really do matter and really do exist. And that's what you see with some of these player changes. And I think the most recent one probably is the FaZe example, because Bimas, who's playing for Mouse now, he came out and basically said, like, listen, I was just plugged into all these things because there was no time to practice, and that was just what I needed to do, and I wasn't comfortable doing any of it. But like, that's kind of what it is. And I think that used to be fairly common whenever teams didn't have a lot of time, and I think it still remains fairly common. Though today, I think it's more of a question of teams preferring to play more tournaments instead of practicing and putting in the time to sort of get used to that. Whereas today, I think they have the optionality; they just have to turn something down to do it.
Sure. I mean, I'll even give an example. I forget if actually it was one of the polls themselves who told me this, or if I noticed it in demos and then they just corroborated it. But I remember, when they first added Pasha, who obviously was like a more skilled AWPer than fucking Luke was, because Luke actually was kind of like one of those AWPers where it's like, how did they get those kills? Like, they don't look that fast, they don't look that skilled, but they just know the game, like, they're just veterans in that sense. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I remember when they like first brought in Pasha, and people forget that first year, like the first half of the year, they were just shit. Like it took them ages to get online, and they were looking really bad because obviously they just left that org and they did that new project, and everyone thought this is the end. And one of the things I noticed was, it's just a tiny detail, in most of the T-side tactics, like Luke would be the guy who like watched the back or something, just watched the flank. And so when he just wasn't there doing that, they obviously had never communicated. This is just something he must have just done. Well, obviously Pasha would never do that. Especially back then, he wasn't a very cerebral player. Like, I assume they were just getting reamed up the arse all the time by like some fucker like probably Ruit just pushing behind, and they're like, what, who wasn't covered that? It's like, who's supposed to be oh yeah, that guy we kicked. Yeah, like, shit, that's bad luck. And the other thing is this, right? One of the reasons, I mean, let's face it, FaZe is always going to be the ultimate example of the fact that, like, surely something like roles and role balance exists. Because they've had years now where if it was true that every smart and skilled player can play every role, they'd have figured it out by now. The fucking puzzle box would have come together. They would have made fucking, like, the Infinity Stones, basically, and just Thanos the universe, wouldn't they? Like, in theory, look at the lineups they've had over these years. Like, I even think, I'll even draw this a little bit further, because FaZe is obviously the ultimate example, so I want to get your take on this. I have two conspiracy theories, right? One is that, because, dude, I watch these broadcasts. I'm on these broadcasts sometimes. And when we talk about FaZe, first of all, everyone regurgitates the narrative of the 2017 team of like, well, they're some of the most skilled aimers in the world, and, if they get it together, they can beat anyone. It's like, what? That hasn't even been true for years now. When you talk, Karrigan was kicked. He was removed as IGL in like the summer of fucking 2018 or something like, or like, just going into the fall. Mm-hmm. Like that was ages ago. And it's not like they haven't had the talent since then. They've had loads of talent. It's like, if anything, their team is just Nico bashing his head against a brick wall over and over again. Like, eventually I'll get the right teammates. It's like, homie, there's never going to be right teammates for you. Like, however you're modeling the game, it doesn't exist for everyone else. So like, that's one of them that I have. And then the other one is that I don't know how this is possible, because every other great IGL, every other great player that tried being an IGL, Shox is a great example, they all eventually, called Zera, they all eventually just go, yeah, it isn't for me, actually, I'm going to go back. Nico just never does that second part. He must be like the slowest learner ever. I don't get it, because he's such a brilliant player. Like, my joke basically is, the only IGL that can always shut down Nico the star player is fucking Nico the IGL. That's like the fucking witty way of saying it. So, what do you think on some of this? Because obviously FaZe is the best like extreme example to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, that I think we've seen this throughout Karrigan's career to some extent. Is like, whenever he joins a team, like, he clearly brings a bunch of structure with him.
There's a guy that knows roles.
He always makes the teams better, at least initially. They usually also tend to peak relatively soon after he joins. If you look at all the teams that he's played, whether it's like the the previous Astralis team is
TSM.
TSM at the time, or then FaZe, and then now Mouse. But they always tend to run into issues for a reason or another later on. But he always makes them better initially, and I think a big part of that is just like giving structure. And part of the reason why they tend to do well even after he's usually been getting removed is that I think they retain a bunch of that structure, but then they just replace him with a better player at that point. The only problem is like, at some point the structure slowly disappears. There's nobody nagging players in practice to do the right thing here and there, and then like people just get caught into bad habits. So I fully buy into that. I think FaZe has had a bunch of really incredible rosters during the Karrigan era, also after Karrigan. I don't really know how they think about team building, to be honest. Like, I would have thought that they should, like, if I were Nico, I probably would have just wanted to pick up anybody who wants to call at all. Like, whether it's like Golden, just get like somebody who's just like willing to do that. Just to like take it off your plate, and like you can give him guidance. Like, the reason all these really good players want to call at some point, like whether it's Shocks or Cold or Nico, whoever, is that if you're a smart player, you can always have one or two good reads in a half. Like when you get to pick your spots, that's the difference. The annoying and hard part about being a caller is that whether you have an idea or whether you want to call something that round, you always have to have something. There can't be a round where it starts and you have no view as to what to do. That doesn't work. It's a lot easier if you're just sort of there in a secondary capacity, and then a couple times a half you notice something, you have a read, and if you're always right the times that you speak up, obviously you feel like, hey, like this actually seems like I would be better than somebody, because every time I speak, we win. It's like an adverse selection problem though, because you only speak up when you have your best ideas, and everybody else is forced to speak regardless of how comfortable they feel about it. And I think that's why people constantly trick themselves into doing it. But that's it, by the way. I wasn't a caller when I started playing either. I started calling because I thought that I could do a better job, and we ended up doing better. So I guess in my part, it at least worked out back then.
Here's the thing. Even as you were saying that and hearing yourself saying it, it must have hit home a little bit when you were saying, like, just because they kick the in-game leader and put in a more skilled player doesn't mean, they just retain a lot of the structure. Because if people don't know, in 2008, lurppis' team, after this is how bad these guys were. After cutting everyone else in the team selectively and also bringing them back like 3 months later or whatever, they just eventually realized, like, it's like anyone, like, maybe we should just cut lurppis as well, even though he was literally the in-game leader doing everything, right? And the best part is, when they cut him and brought back, I think it was T-Hop, they brought back the AWPer, right? When they got T-Hop back, who obviously was a more overall skilled player, but knew fuck all about tactics, by the way. All they did, and the reason we know this, by the way, is because we have an inside man. lurppis' brother still played on the team. All they did was just keep all of lurppis' tactics, all his structure, and just basically, if they fragged out, because they had like 5 really good players, they could do like some of the best results. They could come like 3rd or sometimes 2nd or 4th or something. And they could get all these big wins, but they could never evolve beyond that point because they were just trapped in like a prison that you'd created for them. And then obviously that just over time just became more and more outdated. And then I assume they just thought they were missing their shots as well. You can talk to this. Come on. It was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it goes a little bit deeper than that, because I think if you knew the whole story of how some of those roster changes were made at 3 a.m. after losses at tournaments, like you wouldn't believe it how some of those things went down. But I mean so they played without me for like 3 months, I think, maybe 4 months, and then I played with I put together a pug with Natu and played them at a WCG qualifier, and we came within like a round of beating them because we just read them every round, even though we had like really bad players on our team. And then like next week, Conte messaged me and like, hey, you wanna join the team back? Like they basically had just like lost all the routine, weren't practicing, didn't know how to run anything anymore. And I honestly think the biggest thing is just like not having anybody nagging on you, like you get into bad habits. But it's nicer when it doesn't happen. Nobody likes to listen to somebody else complain. It's not enjoyable.
Because the other thing, I forgot the other conspiracy theory. Right, here's the other conspiracy theory, and this one is barely even a conspiracy theory. That is just real, which is. The reason why I brought up the thing that where they bring up the old FaZe narrative is the reason they do it, lurppis, is because it's awkward to say when you listen. If you're an analyst, obviously you respect Nico's game. He's a fucking amazing individual player. Like he's going to go down as one of the best players ever. So you don't want to be going on desks doing what I do basically, which is like the guy seems like something of an egotist. He's very stubborn and he's sort of fucking up his own career, because that's not a cool storyline. Who the fuck wants to hear that? Like, you want to believe that it's going to work out, and that because he's smart individually, that's going to apply to the team. So as a result, I've noticed analysts do their absolute best not to criticise FaZe too hard. They just sort of make it like, just give him time, or like, it's a new player. It's like, mate, how many new players have they fucking had?
The funny thing that nobody ever catches on to, by the way, this is super obvious, but like people just like won't have the view, is that the easiest way to be well liked and popular is to only say nice things about everybody. People always say that like you do it or I used to do it to be like
for attention or whatever. Yeah,
that's actually the easiest way to be disliked, and not like people do not want you to be around. But like, what's the fucking point? What's the point of just like repeating the same thing everybody else does or everybody else says? But that actually is the easiest way.
And here's the problem, right? It's bad enough they've got all the players we fucking love. Like, even when they had Guardian and Olaf, like, I love those guys. What, you think I don't like Cold Zero, Rain? But here's the problem. It's bad enough they've got all the fan favourites. Then they've got Yanko, our literal friend who we used to all work with in a really pulling photo. So I think the problem is people know if I go too hard on FaZe, because obviously when you watch FaZe, you're just like, what are you doing in these practice games, boys? Like, it's been years now. Where are the tactics? Like, the problem is that is sort of Yanko's job. So I'm like, awkward, like, so you just don't want to say anything. So as a result, though, we've now created a monster dude, because I think, no joke, like, it's become like, it's like a self-reinforcing scenario, because no one criticizes them and they believe it all works, and it's all like the next guy is the right one. Like, they're just trapped in purgatory. They just keep going through the same cycle over and over, because I've said this a million times. Think of all the versions of FaZe. There's not a single one that actually ever did have everyone frag out. In fact, and this is, listen, I'm going to sound like I blow my own horn here. If you look at the most successful versions of FaZe, they just also break down into like Mars standard model of how you make a team, basically. You have a couple of them who are like frag out all the time. You have one who does it when he can, it's the right map and he has the right spots, you know. You have the guy, Olaf Meister in this case, forced to play supportive. Rain somewhat's forced to do that. And then whoever the IGL is, it depends how good they are. Sometimes they're just an IGL. They're just there to not die and do a call around or something. So like, I don't know why people think that's the example, because you know the problem is, the downside is FaZe mixed with the fact that FPL's the new way you get into pro player has sort of convinced a generation of players that despite what Astralis has done, they look at FaZe and they're like, that's the team I'm going to be in. I'm going to just frag out and we're all going to have a great time and I'll just learn the game as I go. And so I feel like they might have actually warped like a whole generation of young players, unfortunately, because I don't see where the next like great supports is. Where are those guys, you know?
Well, part of the problem also is that like the way players come up now is almost always they get picked up by some international team, and like that's where they take the leap. Like it's pretty rare for there to be like just a nice perfect fit for you to do that domestically. Like for example, Zywo did. A lot of the time it is a team like Mouse or FaZe or somebody else who has an international roster speaking English that's willing to take a shot on some of these guys. And when it happens that way, you don't organically just build a team. When you build a team out of nothing, a lot of the time it is, you know, from one country, it's people you know, etc. And that's where you sort of build more of a team-ish team, if you will. So, you know, where you think about the roles and you don't have such a big talent pool to pick out from. So some of the players just sort of naturally end up being support players, role players, etc. But when it's all built through, like you said, through FPL and through these international rosters, it's just a lot easier to pick the guy who looks like they have the highest ceiling. Never mind whether they're actually going to be able to get to that level in a team environment. I mean, like we've seen some of these examples. Obviously, I think like Rops is probably the best example of someone who really did do well.
Sure.
Where if he went to an international team and just came out of FPL, didn't have any experience, but turned out to be like a very good complete player. It's obvious he's just like a smart player. You know, he's just not there because he happens to have really good hand-eye coordination if you watch him play. Then there's a lot of these other players who like, you know, they just like not look the same in a team environment. You think about Frozen, like, you know, when people were talking about him before he joined Mouse, like what he could do as part of like a bad team against good teams, looked amazing. Yes. Looked like one of those guys who could conceivably be like one of the next Nikos, because remember, that's how Nico was. Nico was an amazing player in a bad team, and he was just like racking up insane numbers, but he was always in losses and against like semi-good to very good teams, but never in the biggest matches. And I think it's just it's a hard adjustment, and like coming up that way, it's hard to come up if you're the fourth best player individually on a team, because you're just not going to be the guy who who gets picked up unless you work your way through lower levels. Sort of how I suppose like Bubsky has now gotten onto Astralis from, like, he wasn't one of the star players even in Xinged when they got picked up by Mad Lions.
Yeah, I mean, the irony of that, by the way, because I'm very interested to actually see how Bubsky will do in Astralis, is, as you're saying, because he didn't just come up like Nico style, like he drags you across the line. It's more like, I mean, listen, I'll tell you right now, in late 2018, I did that Star Series where ENCE won, where it was kind of a depleted field, but there's still a couple of good teams like Mouse Sports there and stuff. And at that tournament was where Bobsky was in that team with Refresh called Fragsters, right? And they made the playoffs, like they 3-0'd the Swiss systems. Everyone's like, oh my God, the next talents. And then they did like nothing in the playoffs and like got bodied by like fucking dog shit like Vegas Squadron or something, who, by the way, was also getting that insane Kiev Cyber Arena buff.
Was that the same Fragsters team that Stown came up from?
I think so. I think he was just really young at the time.
Yeah,
he was.
It's a pretty good core, though.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, it was one of those ones where, like, again, if you're like Astralis, you're like, why the fuck aren't I allowed an academy team? Like, I'd just pick these guys up, wouldn't I, and wait 3 years? But anyway, the point I was going to make was, I watched those games. And Bobsky wasn't like fucking spiraling and just wrecking everyone, mate. So as a result, unfortunately, I think he's a skilled player who learned his place in a system. And that old thing we say in English, like a rising tide carries all ships. As the tide went up, as the team got better and the structure got better, and obviously eventually they replaced Hunden, who was the one thing holding them back in terms of in-game fragging. All of a sudden, now he looks amazing. Now he's like, could be the MVP of Flashpoint if you want to argue that angle. So it's like, I'm a little bit suspicious. Like, listen, to be fair, he did go to the other best team that has a good structure, so that might work for him. But if they just imagine he's just some monster, like, superstar player, I think they might be in for a bad surprise on that one. And in fact, I think Mad Lions, by the way, is a great example. In fact, not even Mad Lions, let's draw it back. Because let's face it, Mad Lions, even though it wasn't in the end executed by him, it was the creation of Hunden. He put that team together. He put all those pieces in that way. He put them in the different roles. He made everyone look good. Like, anyone who thinks he just went and found 4 skilled players, he didn't. Like that Roy guy, he's like fucking 26 years old and he's another one of those players who has like, he has an aim like you if you went and played down, mate, but he just knows his role and does his job, has a good attitude. So what I have to think is this. Hunden takes Tricked, who again was like a DreamHack Open team who would make the final and lose. He takes them, when he's replaced, his structure wins a bigger version of a DreamHack with like slightly better teams in Flashpoint. Then Hunden goes to Heroic. This is the best example that roles exist, because I know from talking to Hunden, he's a boomer like us. He actually has that like old school philosophy. And here's how you know it exists. Because the Heroic lineup was more like a Danish mini phase. They were all just like, we got a whole bunch of aimers. And he obviously just came in and was like, well, listen, you still have to play your roles and have structure. Like, I'm going to put you here, you here. All of a sudden they win like fucking ESL1 Cologne. Like, if there's no,
they've got
if an old fucking,
the last couple of months.
If an old boomer with curly hair is like that much better than all the best top pro players understanding the game, there's something to this, guys. There's something to this.
Yeah, no argument there.
What do you think though? Because actually, to go back to your experiences in the Finnish scene, as I was alluding to before, like basically I was writing something recently and I had to give 2 examples. So I had to tell the story of ENCE basically. So I had to point out that like, and then they brought in Sonny. And so obviously when I'm describing it, I'm like, like one of the best Finnish player, but I have to describe, but it was weird because they replaced their in-game leader, who many people thought was like quite smart. Then I have to later in the story go, and then they brought in Yampi, one of the best young talents, and replaced basically their sort of like, I'd say like mildly critically acclaimed support player in X7. Like I thought that was another guy. He was like the Finnish Zipniks, mate. He just seemed to know what the fuck he was doing. So when I'm explaining this, right, fans are going to think, if they sort of know my philosophy on roles, like, wow, that's so shocking. Why would they do that? But like, as I was alluding to before, Finland especially was one of those countries where they did just cycle, like whoever was in the worst in the team, you're kicked, and then whoever's the best on the like team that beats us, the underdog, you're recruited, and then they also just used to ignore like what we were talking about earlier. Like, say you get a BMAS type player who was the stud on his team, and now he's just the shit roll on your team. Well, inevitably he's going to do badly, and they would never think, maybe we didn't use him correctly. They just go, he's just overrated. Actually, kick him out again and get the next guy. It's like there was just an endless supply of bodies. So, like, give us some thoughts, because obviously you come from quite a different background. Like, the people, I'm betting even some of the ENCE players maybe wouldn't agree with this philosophy.
I mean, probably not. I think both of those changes, and obviously, I know many of the guys on ENCE really well. I've known Dalu for more than like probably 10 years now. I've known Sonny for I don't know, 8 years, 9 years. Like he basically was like a random Finnish kid playing pugs when I got to know him. It's been a long time. And Alup, I actually played with at the very end of my playing career. I think both of the changes that they made, like if I were running the team, I don't know about the second one. I think at that point they just needed to make a change. But I think there just needs to be a change. I don't know whether that was the right one or the wrong one, but there certainly needed to be a change if you just looked at how they were playing at the time. So, but I think the Alexa B change was like, there was more to it. Obviously, it's not just like how they were playing. I think everybody was getting frustrated that they constantly were getting seconds and thirds and whatever, losing close games that they thought they should be winning and never really getting the biggest wins. I obviously, spoke to many of the players at the time, and I, explained, I especially reiterated some of them. I'm like, listen, like, it feels like you're always going to be one of the best teams now, because that's been the case for the last like 3 months, 6 months, but like, it doesn't always have to go that way. Like, sometimes like it just disappears and like, you don't know how to get back there. And like every single time you make a roster change, you run the risk and you don't really know like ahead of time what you're missing. Very often, like a lot of the time, people don't appreciate the little things that are happening. It doesn't even have to be the caller. It might just be somebody who just, reminds people to do the right thing, like stay close enough to trade or keeps up the comms or, comms some stuff on behalf of other players who are more quiet, things like that are sort of harder to notice, at least if you're not paying attention. I think everybody on the team sort of understood many of those things. And I think there was just like other stuff going on that they just like couldn't get past. And then, sometimes you get in these situations. Like it's still a game that's very much driven by the players who are on the server. And like, I don't know that there's many teams. I think today there are some, but not many where it's actually run as a sports organization where the GM, and not LeBron GM, but an actual GM, sort of decides what's going on. And I think, do I think that roster move was the right one to make at the time? Like, I thought they could be better. I also thought that there was a very, very high chance that they could be worse. It certainly was like on a risk adjusted basis. I think you definitely don't make that move until you start playing worse.
By the way, even though you notice I'm pushing the topic, obviously I want Flashpoint teams to improve, of like GMs are a big deal and we need to get good people in there. Don't worry, Lurppis. I'm not under any sort of mad delusion that like we're ever going to go and reverse time in sports and go back to when like all teams were on like that. Because listen, I've noticed in the NFL and hockey where the individual player just can't have like the insane impact all the time. In those sports, the GM just runs everything. He can pick anyone he wants. He can cut your best friend if he's a good player. Like, because in basketball, the star player, first of all, it getting a fucking king's ransom in money. It's just an insane amount. And you've also literally like, he basically does like let's say like 40% of the game. Like he just does it himself. So like, it's actually funny because the NBA has come closer to what we're talking about. We're trying to get away from in CS. Like, the NBA is full of Nico motherfuckers just making all the calls and just doing everything that they want around themselves. And then, like you say, GM LeBron, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's different in games where you have substitutes and the best players don't play that much. Like you said, hockey is a good example. The best defensemen play, 28 minutes a game. And that's a defense when the best people in offense play 23 minutes a game. So there's a limited amount of impact you can have on the game, no matter how good you are, assuming you're playing among the other best players. So, in the NHL in this case, if you're in the NBA, the best players are going to play like 40, 45 minutes in the playoffs. That's what LeBron's been doing for the last decade. So the impact that he's going to have, particularly given that he's going to be ball handling the entire game, is just, multiples of that. So as a result, like you also have to care about his opinion more, because he's the guy who can single-handedly just wreck your team if he gets unhappy and just wants out, for example. But that's the part that people don't always, I think about or give enough give enough attention to, is there's just the fact that there's no substitutes in Counter-Strike. I guess now there's a couple 6-man rosters, but like no real subs anyway. I think just makes roster building a lot harder.
Sure. Well, of course, yeah, especially because then everyone has to be good at the same time. So it's like spinning fucking plates, isn't it? Because you get a few in order and then that guy goes in a slump while you were fixing the other guy. And like I feel so bad for some of the coaches. Like, what do people think they're going to do? Like, they're not miracle workers. They just do the best they can. Because one aspect, right, I'll give you a good example, actually, of someone else that was making me think about roles. Obviously, if you follow how most people thought about the Vitality team last year, it was like, obviously, Zero just carried the fuck out of them, fragging-wise. And then Alex seemed like he like got better and better and became like a pretty good IGL. I never thought he was the best. I was never overhyping him or anything, mate. But he seemed like he was competent. He knew what he was doing, and he like obviously he was still quite young in the role, so he was developing into it. But then I always used to say about the others, I used to just think like it's like obviously the numbers were never good for the others, so it was more like they just don't like die too much. They just sort of like get out of the way enough and do the basic bare minimum, and then Ziwu hard carries the fuck out of them. Actually, this year, because obviously they lost Alex, and adding Shocks, who obviously at times has been one of those power mad, like, I'm going to be the IGL type guys. I was really worried they'd be way worse, like they might fall off a cliff. But the interesting thing, I think, about how they've become like one of the best teams, and even one of the most consistent teams, is because it's really thrown, basically, a lot of spotlight onto RPK. Because if you only look at the numbers, you'd say this guy's shit, get him out the team. Like, he's super old, his stats are just pedestrian as fuck. But if you talk to anyone who's been his teammate in these squads, they say basically, he's the guy who just literally says, like, just give me whatever spot you want in the game. And then here's the mad part. Listen, there's a lot of players have tried that part, but this second part is what a lot of people cannot do. Supposedly, when you put him in that spot, he never complains. As in, even if they're just fucking him in that spot, the other team, or he's having a bad game, because he's like a super vet who comes like this place, he played like CS for like 15 years or something. He just thinks in his mind, like, I'll just deal with it. Like, I'll just adapt next round. And if you notice, his aim is even almost perfect for that, because he also has like just sort of like just all right spray, but he just sort of like knows how to use angles. And so, like, if you have a guy like that, the others don't even have to have superstructure around them. Like, that's almost like, you know, in the way like an MVP does way more than everyone else, but like on the offensive side or carrying that. It's almost like you're like a sleeper carry in a way if you do that, because you're taking all the shit from everyone else and all the stuff that no one wants to do. So that means by default, everyone else is getting an easier time of it. So I actually think a guy like that is basically like, in a way, they're worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of the like my favorite teammates that I ever played with, they're often ones who were in like super flashy or, you know, considered like the best players, but they were the ones who sort of did like just quietly did their part, never complained, and like always did their thing. So you never had to worry about them. So like, for example, if you think EG, like Fraud and Nothing were obviously like the quote unquote star players of the team. So like they were the guys who were super high maintenance. Like you had to always like think about them, like think about what they want to do, like how to play off of them, etc. So then you needed who we had Good for Nothing and Storm as like the, you know, quiet RPK types who basically just always do the right thing and are happy doing it and like don't complain and like help everything else work. And you kind of needed that to have like the balanced two other guys on the other end. And you just need that, I think, in many of the teams. And I think like in many of the other teams, like the Shiri, you might remember when in the earlier teams, like he was basically that guy. Generally, like not the greatest teammate, I think. Over the like, there's been like bunch of things that weren't great, but like really good to play with when he's like, well, you know, when he has like good attitude, etc. And like he always did all the annoying work, and he never complained about any of that. Basic, I think in WinFact was a bit like that, and my brother was also sort of forced into that. I think he could have been a star if he sort of forced himself under that role. But I think once Ruud and Conte had the more fragging roles, just because of being the opposite ends of playing the super lurker and the super aggressive player, he kind of fell into just doing the right thing at all times. Then obviously he was like super overqualified for that role.
Because like to me, that was actually one thing that I found so weird about how people looked at the CS scene. Because to me, last year was the best to highlight the discussion we've been having here. Because listen, yeah, the top team, you know what? Here's the irony of it all. FaZe never really got it together long term. Like they had a while where they were very good, but I always used to say, you can't tell, like, you know, when people would be like, FaZe is 5 fraggers out, they got fucking Karrigan, you dickhead. What are you talking about? Like, first of all, Karrigan's a very good in-game leader. And secondly, he's definitely not just doing like Faris go kill. He's doing like, he's basically just doing like no huddle offense. How about that? It's like, it's more like Peyton Manning or fucking one of these players, you know. It's more like he's just using the fact that he's doing it on the fly. That's what's going to throw you off, which is also, in my opinion, by the way, why he's choked in a bunch of the finals. Because I tell you what, that's going to be the hardest fucking skill to maintain when you're shitting your pants one round for winning the major. Like, you're not going to be having that awesome flow state where you're just thinking of great ideas. That's when you wish you could open a fucking 10-page playbook like Glaive has every time and go, right, number 7, just do the, you know, like, it's no wonder.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to play that role, which I think is also a big part of the reason why they had so many of those famous collapses in the finals. You know, Oakland against NIP,
yes.
the Katowice
probably the most
final
egregious
against
one.
Fnatic, the Cloud9 major final E-League. You know, all those. I think every single one of those basically fell on their T side. I think Oakland was Cash T side. I think it was 12-6 and for them. I think E-League was Inferno T side 15-11, I think, maybe.
Yes.
And then Katowice, I mean, they just got blown out, I think.
On train.
I think in the end, yeah, but like those were the how. I mean, look, it's the best way to play if you can make it work, because it's the hardest to read. It's the most adaptable. Like if you can make it work with good enough players, you can do the most things. Like you'll be ready for anything. The downside is that like if people aren't playing well, it's the most volatile, and it puts more pressure on those other players. So it doesn't even have to be you who chokes. It doesn't necessarily have to be Karrigan who messed that up. It's enough if one or two of those guys on the team are super nervous and are not doing their thing, because in that case, it doesn't actually matter what Karrigan calls, because the other guys are not doing what they're supposed to be doing anyway. And that's where I think it's helpful to have some more routine and structure that you can kind of fall back on in some of those times.
But anyway, yeah, the point I was going to make was the real irony is the team who actually did the FaZe Clan style better than FaZe was just Team Liquid. Like they actually were the team, if you remember, where even Nitro would just like frag out in games. You were like, what the fuck? What's going on here? And you just knew. That's why people used to think I was riding the hype train or I hated Astralis. It's like, dude, if you just watched them when they were in their prime, the eye test was fucking bonkers. It's like, how can you if you can play like that? I mean, even on Deagle rounds, we could just kill everyone, mate. Like, you don't feel like you can lose. Like, it looks perfect. Yeah. But here's the irony of it, right? At the same time they were the best, who were the second and third best teams? The Vitality team we just talked about, where everyone criticised everyone except one player, and your Ents team, where I always used to say, what I loved about that Ents team is, it's like I used to say about the Poles. They had just enough skill to make it work. And they had enough skill that it activated like all those brilliant tactics and amazing CT setups and bizarrely, I mean, actually, let's get some thoughts on that. What do you think overall about that aspect before I ask something else?
I mean, that's how the rivalries work a lot of the time, right? Like whoever ends up becoming the best team or whatever is usually based off of how the previous teams were at the time. That's how the styles in matchups tend to work. So I think it makes a lot of sense if you put it in that perspective. You know, you have the super skilled team on one end, and then you have a couple of the more tactical teams that play complete opposite, basically. Not that they don't have skill, but like they have to rely on something else.
That's the counter. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Put it this way,
you're not beating that Liquid team at their game. You're just not at that point in time. Like there's no chance. That's why many of the grand finals teams just got completely blown out.
Well, it's like the obvious example would be like if anyone's watching the NBA playoffs right now, right? Every fucking like talking head ESPN guy, because you know I've told you, they've just taken, like what happened is years and years ago in sports media in America, they figured out that if you just make the story that like the quarterback of the NFL team, like it's like he's just the chess master and like whether they win or lose, it's just him. They just applied that to every sport. So what they do is they take the superstars, and because the two best superstars arguably play on the Lakers, they just make it sound like the Lakers can't lose. But if you actually know anything about stylistic matchups, you would know that the best teams to beat the Lakers are people who shoot tons of threes and have loads of shooters, which is every fucking team in the league. So even though they have two monsters who could win you the game themselves, it's actually stupid as fuck that people make it sound like they're never going to get challenged, because they're going to get challenged all the time because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean they also just are much worse than some of the other teams that are remaining in, you know, from third through call it sixth spot. So it's you know, it's about more than just who's the best player, as we've seen with, you know, Simple and Zaiwu, for example. It's not enough for you to be the best. You need other people as well. It's a team game.
But which is also, by the way, why like probably the worst analysis in the history of sports was that year where it was the last year where the Warriors won, where they just like swept it was when LeBron, right, was doing like god tier shit, but every bozo with like Kevin Durant outplayed him. It's like, dude, that's like
game one of the finals, that LeBron performance that ended up in the unfortunate J.R. Smith mess up. Like if J.R. passed LeBron, and that might have been like one of the best playoff games by anybody ever.
But this is the thing, dude. They would make it like Kevin Durant won the duel. It's like, that's like Kevin Durant has like loads of teammates and LeBron has nothing. Like he's playing like 1v5, you daft cunt. Like so unfair, isn't it? Dude, his teammate's the MVP of the last few years. Like what are you talking about? Like, so anyway, here's what I was going to ask you. This is just purely for my own benefit, but I thought it's just funny because you'd appreciate it. So you know when Ents became really good, and like I say, they would win all these clutch games. Like famously, it was Train was the most classic one because their CT side on Train would be like not that great because they weren't so skilled, but the amount of T rounds they could get, that's why they had to use all those setups on CT side. So I always used to think, if you can be like the absolute best on that, like you've figured something out about the game. So if you remember, people, because obviously one of the cool things about ENCE is everything starts as a meme because it used to just be a little team that wasn't going to win, and then eventually it becomes true. Like eventually, like they were kind of like, it was almost like all the shit about Alexi B's tactical, like half that shit seems true now. But here's the thing that I thought was an amazing meme that people have so misread was, when people heard that term, sisu, in that Finnish term, that's like, like grit or like determination. Yep. So here's the hilarious thing, dude. I made a whole, I can't remember if I made a video about this. I should if I haven't, because it's amazing. People started thinking, right? You have to remember, lurppis, not a lot of people follow hockey in like modern sports. Like, not a lot of kids know it, and especially no Europeans do. It's just all Americans who do, basically, unless you're like from Sweden or Russia. So as a result, the only things they know about Finland are this. They are all robots. And then Sisu now, and ENCE. And then the third one is that famous sniper who killed like 700 fucking people because he's just a maniac. Yeah. Yeah, that fucking legend you get. So as a result, right, you're going to love this, lurppis. They really think this is a real cultural thing they've taken because of ENCE. They think all Finns are like insanely cool under pressure, never choke, and always deliver in the big game, right? And I just remember, when I saw this, right, I couldn't believe it. Because first of all, I know all the Finnish teams in 1.6, and that was the exact opposite. These were the Team Liquid motherfuckers who got to 14 rounds, and then you could have bet your house they were going to find a way to lose. And then have that sob story afterwards, And then the other thing is, I've lived in Finland. Every year, Finland believes they're going to win the World Championship. And if you ever get to that final, again, listen, lurppis, if I was a betting man, I don't give a fuck who's on the other side of that game. I'm putting my money. So, what do you think about this? Because do you agree with me? It actually is totally counter, in my opinion, to the real Finnish stereotype. It's just ENCE was a special team.
I think it actually goes back to what you were saying before, which is that it's just like the lazy, easy narrative to sort of hang on to and apply on it and then just use it across the board. I actually thought that the reason that ENCE wound up being sort of clutch and started winning a bunch of the close games was specifically because they used to lose all of them before. That's how me and Natu used to think about it. Is They had a bunch of close losses. ESL Cologne, I think it was 2018. That was the first big event where they did well. I think they beat Mouse and beat NIP maybe, and then lost to Navi. I think that might have been the matchups.
I think so.
And then they had a couple of close losses that fall, and they always just kind of fell short of getting to an interesting spot. And then I think the first tournament they won was actually the Star Ladder that you mentioned earlier. That was the very first one, and even that they actually came close to losing against.
It was
Vegas
a 5-game map in the series,
exactly. Pretty bad team, but they finally won that. Then they won DreamHack Winner, and then I think that just kind of flipped the switch. And I think that's how it works a lot of the time. That I think people just don't necessarily always appreciate when they haven't necessarily gone through it themselves. Is that it's not that it's not that confident. It's some random thing whether you have it or not. I always feel pretty confident about anything. It's just how I am. It's all the other things that are sort of intangible that come with it. So when you've won a bunch of those close games, or when you've lost a bunch of those close games in a row, you kind of come in expecting to some extent that hey, we've lost all of these before, so we're probably not the favorites at this point, or at least it's a toss up, whatever. But if you win a couple of them, eventually the way you're going to start thinking about it is hey, this is it's 14-14, these are the matches that we always win.
Yes.
So you just get very comfortable, and that also impacts other things that you don't necessarily think about, how you communicate, what you do. It's even minor sounding things, if you know that you always win those games, the other team thinks about that too.
Yes.
So they also might play different.
It's a factor
as a result. So I actually thought that team specifically, I think it was those couple of wins that kind of took him over the hump. And I still kind of think that the ENCE team with Sunny last fall, I think if they won a couple of those close games that they had initially with Sunny, because they did reasonably well at last Moscow. I think they split a couple of games, had a couple of draws, just barely missed playoffs, and then they went to New York. I think they lost to G2 in double OT from, I think it was a pretty big lead or something. And they had a couple. Then they played DreamHack Malmo. I think it's people were just sick or something from travel or whatever. I think it's one of those where and Alo actually said this to me before. He was like, listen, like, I just hope that we don't go through those 3 tournaments and like completely bomb out, because like it's gonna like then that's gonna like really set us back to get us back on schedule. But you've agreed to play those tournaments like 3 months in advance, so you can't really pull out at that point, even though you had no practice. But I thought that if a couple of those games would have gone the other way, I think they potentially could have gotten to better form a lot sooner. And I think starting in the spring over the summer, and I think now they've done reasonably well in EPL, I think that might be getting there. And I don't think the difference between them and like some of the best teams is like as large as people might think. Like they were good enough to beat all these teams last year. I think it's like couple of wins their way. They had a good win against G2 today. It's all online for the time being, but get to play a couple of offline tournaments, get a couple of wins, and I think it might completely change. And I think that's how it works a lot of the time. It's just like 1 or 2 key wins that like completely change how the team feels, etc., that then snowball into bigger things that I think gets overlooked very often.
Or, one of my triggers is like purely linear thinking, where like people basically think that like the same things would always happen the same way. So like the best example ever is, I hate it when someone loses 2 maps, like 14-16, 14-16. They're like, but if they'd have won the first one, they could have won 2. It's like, no, the second map would be totally different, wouldn't it? Like if the first result is different, then it's going to change all the actions. So like actually it wouldn't. So like the best example ever for me, by the way, if you made a documentary about this topic, is obviously FaZe Clan. Like if they just win one of those rounds in regulation and beat Cloud9 and win the major, it wouldn't even matter that it was close. First of all, there's no universe Nico's kicking Karrigan when he's won him a motherfucking major. Secondly, after that, they're not going to be like in all these other scenarios where they're like, shit, I'm choking. It's like they just probably win all that shit, like that actually would have been where they would have just torn the CS scene in half. Like it would have been amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, if you recall, when they first put that team together in the previous fall, like they just like destroyed everybody those first couple of bits. Like one of them was ESL New York. I think they averaged like 6 rounds lost per map. I think there was one map where they were behind against Astralis that were like they were down like 6-8, and that was like the only time that they were even trailing after like 5 rounds of play in the entire tournament. So I actually think that like if just the NIP game would have gone differently, I think they might have just been on a completely different path the whole time.
By the way, what is your theory on that thing I said about Finns? Like, is there some cultural thing you can nail? Because if people don't know, that's why I always think like, when again, people have like lazy catch-up. So for example, when people start talking about like Nordic Counter-Strike, it's like, let's just make it Scandinavia. No, let's just make it fucking Sweden. Or like, let's face it, Sweden and Denmark are pretty different. I think the only ones that are similar are Sweden and Norway, mate. They're the only two that I see any similarity between. And then Finland may as well be from fucking another universe. Like, you guys are the Moomins or something. Like, you're just nothing like anyone else. Like, so what is it? Because here's the thing. I made this point to someone. It's weird. Because even though Swedes talk all that woke shit all the time about how everyone's equal, mate, Swedes are some of the most arrogant, entitled motherfuckers in the history of the universe. Like, it's no wonder in Counter-Strike they won everything. They almost believe they're like fucking elves, like of the royal lineage, like they should be the best. Like, but if people don't get this, they really do. Like, those NIP guys, when those NIP guys were like washed up by 2 years, they were still talking like it was unfair that they weren't winning the event. So like, why are Finns the other way? Why do Finns just go that mad, like, self-deprecating way? Where it's like I was alluding to before, every experience I think of with Finns is like, it's after you've just lost, like, the semis of the final of the World Championship in hockey, and it's just a guy with, like, a fucking beer, like, well, we will get them next year. It's like, it's the same shit every time, and like, everyone's been there to that party.
So I think the actual answers you'd have to go like a little bit deeper into like Finnish history, I think. Okay. But I mean, like that's how like Finnish people just generally are. I mean, you spend a reasonable amount of time in Finland. Like I think that the way most people perceive Finns to be from like the older Counter-Strike guard is like me and Natu generally, and we're not very representative of most Finnish people, I think, just from like being outspoken and some more social, etc. There's I think the best way to summarize Finns is one of my friends, one of my American friends found this joke somewhere and told me. I've always thought it was funny. It's this, how you can tell a Finn is outgoing? They look at your shoes when they talk to you.
That's pretty good, actually.
I think that's like a reasonable summary. I mean, it's just cultural. I don't know what like ultimately drives it, but I think it's cultural. I think that's how people tend to be in general, more broadly.
As we end this episode, I'll give everyone a little anecdote from my life, actually, when I was in Finland. This is a fucking... this also just shows what a weird... If you come from, like... Put it this way, if you live in the world, like, of Hollywood movies and shit in America, like, you're not going to get this at all. But, like, one day, me and Natu would just go into the shop or something, right? Just go to the supermarket. And as we're walking along, there's a guy... And it's like 2 p.m. in the afternoon. There's a guy just pissed drunk on, like, vodka just walking around the street because, again... listen, Finland isn't Sweden. Like, that just happens. There are just people like that, just, you know, like, just a complete alcoholic, just walking around, just drunk on vodka. And he just walks up to me and Natu. This is like the day after, like, Russia had beaten Finland in hockey or something. And he just goes, like, and said something in Finnish to Natu or whatever. And then Natu's like, yeah, whatever, mate. And then he starts, like, trying to say something to me. And I'm just saying to the guy, look, mate, I don't speak Finnish. Look, mate, I don't even know how in Finnish to say I don't speak Finnish. So, like, I'm saying, like, I don't know it. So then he keeps saying to Natu, translate this for me, like, in, like, fucking Finnish. And then Natu's like, oh, right, look, he's going to keep bothering us until I translate. Look, all he wants to say is, like, do you speak Finnish? And I was like, well, obviously not. Like, I can't talk to him, can I? And then so Natu says that to him, like, can't speak Finnish or whatever. And then the guy just says back to Natu, gets like a huge smile on his face, and then just basically says in Finnish, like, good, then you can't talk about the hockey, or something utterly fucking insane like that. And then just, like, walks off into the night. Again, like, this is like some shit out of a movie, mate. That just doesn't happen in normal life. You're like, who are these people?
well, keep in mind, the only way that you get interactions with anybody that you don't know in Finland is if they're drunk. So, like, I don't think in my life anybody has ever come up to me to, like, talk to me about Counter-Strike. But to this day, if I go out in Finland, I always get somebody who comes up to me. But it's only after, you know, a couple of promilles of blood alcohol content. That's the only way it works. I actually thought you were going to go to another story when you said you were going to tell a story, but that's the one that's still one of the prime laughs of my entire life.
That one's a private one. That one does not come out on the shows. No. The other thing as well is when you're saying that, by the way, about the fact they have to be drunk. Again, if I would meet, like, Natu's friends, they wouldn't even, like, introduce themselves by name. They would just awkwardly look away, you know. But once they'd got, like, 5 beers in, you just can't keep these motherfuckers' hands off you. They'll be putting their arms around you, like, pulling you in, trying to talk to you. Like, fuck, now you've gone too far the other way. Because listen, I'm like, Brits are fairly awkward. Exactly. So I want to be, like, in the middle there. I don't want to, like, listen, I want to know your name. I don't want, like, physical contact, like, the first day I meet you or whatever. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Spencer Green, Whattathings, Pranogo, Matt Shakowski, Tobias Bernasconi, JDubs, Alexander Rao, Xinged, the Puyallup Tribe, Jensen Goh, Hades, Andreas Kroknes, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in one of those video AMAs I do. Do you want teasers? Do you want to see who the next guests are on my shows? Do you want to take part in an in-depth esports discussion with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.